Absolutely. So, Dr. Eugenie C. Scott is the former executive director of the National Center for Science Education, Incorporated, a not for profit that works to improve the teaching of science as a way of knowing, the teaching of evolution, and the teaching of climate change. A former college professor, Dr. Scott is an internationally known expert on the creationism versus evolution controversy and science denialism. She has received Lifetime Achievement Awards from both the American Humanist Association and the Center for Inquiry, as well as the Skeptic Society's James Randi Award. In 2009, Scientific American named her one of the 10 outstanding leaders involved in research, business, or policy pursuits that have advanced science and technology. Jeannie holds 10 honorary doctorates, and asteroid 249540, Eugenie Scott, is named for her. It's not a coincidence. Also, as we found out last time that she was our guest, she coined the phrase Gish Gallop. Back in 2005, Eugenie was involved with the historic Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District trial, popularly known as the Dover Panda trial, which at the time seemingly drove the nail into the intelligent design coffin. And I did say at the time. Well, last month, the Center for Inquiry and the Freedom from Religion Foundation jointly hosted a conference commemorating the 100th anniversary of the famous Scopes monkey trial, and Eugenie attended that conference. And while there, she participated in a play about the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial, which was written by John Delancey, by the way. And after hearing that, we just had to have her back on to give us the inside story of that conference, as well as to update us on the state of science education in the U.S., of course, since it's been quite a while since she did an RfRx Talks and talked about that very subject. Welcome, Eugenie.
Very lovely to be back. Thank you so much, Rob and Kira. And hello, everybody.
Yeah,
So,
thank you
so-
for joining us. I had the privilege of seeing you just the other day present at a conference, and it was a lot of fun. And I'm so glad we get to have you all to ourselves because I didn't have a chance to corner you there. So we get you all to ourselves now, and what a treat. You come highly recommended. And I am so excited to get to tell people sometimes that we had the inventor of the term Gish Gallop on our program.
I'm convinced that's going to be on my tombstone.
That would
Inventor
be
of the Kiss Gallop.
amazing.
And the Scott procedure for collection of dental nutrition data, which is famous in a much, much smaller list of people.
Fair, fair. Potentially more impactful, but just in
Oh
a
no,
different
oh
way.
no.
No.
But oddly enough, this is completely uninteresting to all but about 50 dental anthropologists in the world. But it's a procedure that I developed for if you're in the field and your problem is looking at the amount of dental attrition or how worn our teeth. This allows you to make an estimate of the amount of wear without having to, measure or take photographs or screw around with, which often you really can't do in the field. And the damn paper is still being cited. I mean, I wrote that thing back in the 70s. It's astonishing. Anyway,
Wow.
two
It's
more.
like the Munsell soil color charts, right? Where
Back when I was a real scientist instead of playing one on television.
that's amazing. Wow, that's really cool. No, that sounds like a pretty good tool that you made there. If people are still using it years later. Wow, that's impressive.
So I have to ask. I was going to look it up after you mentioned this on the last, but I forgot to do that, and I haven't. There is a Wikipedia page for Gish Gallop. Is there a Wikipedia page for the dental thing?
No. According
Oh,
to our beloved Susan Gerbic, Wikipedia pages have to be about significant individuals or activities or whatever. And trust me,
Oh.
the reason I mentioned it is because it's a good joke. And, after all,
Eugenie,
good
there
jokes
was a
are important.
TikTok that went viral where somebody was flipping a Coke bottle from across the room and it landed like straight up, and that has a Wikipedia article. So I'm going to fight for your Wikipedia article on the dental subject.
Amazing. We're gonna have to have you back again to talk about that too. It's gonna be super interesting,
No, it won't
and
be. It'll be a
exciting.
really small audience. Trust me on that. Actually, what I thought was going to be my real contribution, though, since we're belaboring this issue, was that one of the ways of measuring the amount of dental attrition or looking at the data, if you wanted to say compare populations, like these people are mostly seafood eaters, so they get a lot of grit in their food, and so their teeth are really worn down. These people are horticulturalists. They're eating a lot softer food. They've invented pottery. They're cooking food and stuff, so their teeth are less worn. But the difference between the amount of wear in the first molar and the second molar is a way of measuring the rate of attrition, because your first molar, your 6-year molar, they call it, erupts before your 12-year molar. So the amount of difference is roughly the amount of wear that takes place within that 6-year period. And what I thought was going to be a really cool way of looking at dental attrition was to do a principal components analysis on the first and second anyway, it goes on and on. And
It
nobody,
occurs to me in your
nobody,
bio, we didn't even give what your doctorate is in. So yes, what did you?
biological anthropology,
Biological anthropology. Okay.
which is evolution literally from day one, which is how come I got involved in the creationism and evolution controversy, because you can actually take a biology course without dealing with the topic of evolution. There's a number of very courses that it'd be better if you brought evolution in, but whatever. You cannot teach a biological anthropology class without evolution from day one, because that's what we do. So anyway, I digress. Meanwhile, there's the Scopes trial.
Which is about that very thing, right? What are you allowed to teach in school?
Which is why it's been so interesting to me for such a long time. And especially when I started studying it. One of the things that I found out very quickly when I was in the 70s and 80s being introduced to the Scopes trial is that Inherit the Wind is not very accurate. And the image that people have of the Scopes trial is basically of the play or movie Inherit the Wind, which oddly enough was actually written not so much as a science and religion parable, but as an anti-McCarthy freedom of speech parable, because it was written in 1955, which is, of course, right the height of the McCarthy period. And the authors of the play really wanted to make the point that freedom of speech is important. And that is the predominant message of Inherit the Wind. Although certainly the science and religion thing does run through it all the way. I mean, even the title of the play, Inherit the Wind, is from Proverbs. He that troubleth his house shall inherit the wind. Something like that.
I do believe they said that line in the movie, at least.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
so you want to share the poll and go through?
That was one of the Clark Gable quotes, I think, from the film.
Yeah.
to Vivian Lee, yes. Right after I don't give a damn. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. That's now forever going to be mixed up in my memory now, Rob.
And that of many people watching this
program. Sorry all. Sorry, internet.
Amazing.
So how about if we share the poll so Eugenie started to go through the truthiness or not truthiness of it?
Yes. So we've knowledgeable crowd here.
Yeah. Wow. 20%. That is consistent with your assessment, right? Would you say 20% accurate is probably the closest to the right answer here?
Yeah, I really think so. It's obviously 1 and 4 are red herrings. There are many, many, many differences between Inherit the Wind and the actual Scopes trial. Little things like Scopes didn't have a girlfriend. That's a big plot line. He didn't have a girlfriend whose father was a fundamentalist minister. That whole plot line is just total fiction. William Jennings Bryan was not a fundamentalist buffoon. He was actually a very intelligent man, a very well-educated man. I often joke when I talk about the Scopes trial that Bryan would probably have fit into Berkeley just fine. He was for all the progressive causes of his day. And of course, the progressive causes of the period of the robber barons, the early part of the 20th century, were different than the ones today. But he was for women's suffrage. He was for labor rights. He thought that workers should not have to work more than 8 hours without being paid overtime. He was against child labor, more than you can say for the Huckabees in Arkansas. He was against war. He was a pacifist. There are all kinds of things where, you'd say, good on you. At least most of the people, I assume, watching, don't suppose a whole lot of you are really warmongers, so I'm assuming you'd go along with that. But at the same time, we're talking about the early 20th century. Like most intellectuals of the day, oddly enough, he was also a eugenicist and also was a racist, a white supremacist. So, he was not totally admirable on all accounts, but he had a lot of very admirable positions that he took.
Well, isn't it interesting how it seems that those kind of personal beliefs are the ones that may lead otherwise, rational, educated people to reject a certain bit of science because it doesn't match with a different conflicting worldview?
Well, in the talk that you heard, but nobody else heard on this on this webinar, I did point out that there was a lot of confusion with evolution, especially the principle of natural selection, and things like eugenics and things like militarism. In addition to fundamentalism being very strong source of animosity toward evolution. And by the way, just as a footnote, fundamentalism was invented in the early 20th century. This is not traditional Christianity. Fundamentalism was invented in the late 19 teens, and it was a inerrantist kind of view that turned into biblical literalism fairly quickly. And so, yeah, you know, evolution doesn't work with biblical literalism. So a lot of the religious people opposed evolution because of their fundamentalist belief, their conservative Protestant Christian beliefs. But there's a whole lot of liberals like William Jennings Bryan who opposed evolution because they associated it with religion. There was a book called Headquarters Nights by Vernon Kellogg that had been written in the late teens, right around the time of World War I, which claimed that the Germans at the time of World War I were totally swept up in this idea of the master race and that they based it on Darwinian natural selection. They based it on evolution, which historians will argue about this, but I think the majority of them would say, no, that wasn't the motivation for the Germans starting World War I. But World War I was this incredibly destructive and angst-producing historical event. They don't call it the Great War for nothing. It really did tear people up, both in terms of its destructiveness and the number of people killed, but also, you know, the Germans were supposed to be these highly sophisticated people, and look at all the atrocities. This is just terrible. So a lot of liberals objected to evolution because they equated it with German militarism, they equated it with eugenics, and those were wrong reasons for rejecting evolution, but at the time, not irrational ones. So you had a lot of reasons to reject evolution, so to speak. And in Tennessee, this anti-evolution movement, which was growing in the late half of the 19 teens, resulted in a number of states proposing legislation that would either ban or somehow restrict the teaching of evolution. And Tennessee was basically the first, well, actually not the first, but the first really big bill that banned the teaching of evolution, called the Butler Act, named after the legislator who proposed it and got it through. And William Jennings Bryan, by the way, came to Tennessee to basically lobby for this bill. And he gave this big speech before the legislators voted. And by golly, they just voted right along with him. So, yeah.
That's interesting. I don't think they made that point in the movie.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. I mean, you don't expect the play/movie to deal with everything, but the movie mischaracterizes William Jennings Bryan consistently and, you know, paints him as a buffoon. The famous tete-a-tete, as it were, between Bryan and Darrow, Clarence Darrow, where because the defense was outmaneuvered, shall we say, by the prosecution and was unable to have any expert witnesses testify, they had brought in this whole big houseful, literally, of expert witnesses, of scientists and theologians who would testify that it's not anti-religious to teach evolution. And they were all ready to have these very prominent scholars testify as expert witnesses. But since since the prosecution, since the Bryan side wasn't able to find any scientists that were anti-evolution, or at least that, you know, met his criteria, he proposed to the judge that no expert witnesses be allowed to testify at all. And the judge said, fine, you know, let's just keep it simple. Let's just deal with the, you know, we don't need to turn this into a consideration of evolution's bona fides. We're just going to, you know, deal with, did he break the law or not? So all those expert witnesses went home. But that precipitated probably the most stunning aspect of the Scopes trial, which also shows up in Inherit the Wind and is actually the most dramatic scene in Inherit the Wind as well. And that is that when Clarence Darrow, who is kind of the William Jennings Bryan equivalent, except on the liberal side, he was an atheist and an extraordinarily important trial lawyer of the 20th century, according to some, literally the best trial lawyer of the 20th century. He was just outstanding. But when Darrow was unable to bring in any expert witnesses, he proposed to the judge, I would like to interview an expert on religion. Is that okay with you, Judge? Okay, you know, tell me more. I would like to interview William Jennings Bryan. And of course, immediately the prosecution bench just leaped up and said, no, no way, I'm not going to let them do that. That's crazy. That's the most bonkers thing ever. You don't have the prosecution and the defense interviewing each other. This is crazy. But of course, William Jennings Bryan was a man of great ego, and he was quite convinced that he would be able to handle Darrow. In fact, the two guys had actually worked together as young politicians back in the early days of the Wilson administration. They had the same views. They were all for labor and et cetera, on and on and on. But Jennings Bryan was so religious, and Darrow was not at all religious. They really didn't they weren't great buddies, shall we say. And then in later days, they became even more, in opposition to one another.
So
But
as I told you in the pre-show, I was one of the people who didn't really have any questions that
yeah,
that the movie was a reasonable showing of the truth. But if
yeah.
someone forced me to say, well, something in there is not right, I would have said that part was wrong, that you cannot have an
Surprise.
attorney questioning an attorney.
That's the part that's right, more or less, more or less. I mean, they did use a lot of the same topics and even some of the same text from the transcripts of the trial. What happened was, of course, William Jennings Bryan insisted that it was fine with him. He wanted to be put on the witness stand by Darrow, but he held out for the right to also do the same thing to Darrow. Now, I'll tell you a little bit later, Darrow outmaneuvered him, and Darrow did not have to go on the stand, but Bryan did. And of course, the whole goal that Darrow had was to make Bryan look foolish and out of touch and anti-scientific and unmodern and so forth. And he succeeded in doing that pretty well. He asked Bryan questions about where did Cain and Abel get their wives? But Bryan held his own. I mean, Bryan was not a total stumblebum in this whole thing, which is not what is presented as so much in The Earth,
In the
the Wind.
movie, right?
Yeah,
So
in
he
The
was
Earth, the
up
Wind.
on the apologetics of the time.
Yeah. I mean, he was a clever man, and he was a bit of a debater himself. And when asked about where Cain and Abel got their wives, he said, well, I will leave the atheists to look for them. And everybody laughed, and they thought that was great. And, he managed to sort of wiggle out of a lot of stuff, but there's a lot of stuff he just didn't look very good wiggling out of. You all know the story about the Battle of Jericho, where during the Hebrew times, they could only fight during daytime. They didn't exactly have lights. So when the night came up, they all just sort of packed up and went back to their camps. And then as soon as morning came up, they came back again. So Joshua was winning, and Joshua wanted to continue fighting to, finish the fight, because if he quit before he won, the other tribe could come back in the morning and defeat him. So he prayed to God to lengthen the day so that he could continue fighting. And God lengthened the day by stopping the earth. Now, the only way you can lengthen the day by stopping the earth is if it's a geocentric universe. And Bryan realized that, so he kind of wiggled out. He sort of prevaricated and wiggled out of it, didn't come back. But Darrow came right back and smacked him back again, said, oh, well, then perhaps God stopped the sun in the sky, which also doesn't work again. So stopping the planet is a real problem for astronomy. Stopping the sun is a real problem for physics and geology, because, of course, any of these scenarios is just not going to work if you know anything about modern science. And Bryan just did not want to go down that path, but he had to, because Darrow was very good, and Darrow trapped him in a lot of things like that. So what happened was there was a huge number of reporters there. They don't call it the trial of the century for nothing. And the reporters reported in great detail about this tete-a-tete between Bryan and Darrow. And, Bryan was made to look foolish. If you read the transcripts, Bryan didn't do that badly, but by the time the press got hold of it and wrote their articles and spread the information around, Bryan was looking pretty bad. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff that happened. There are things that happen in the play/movie that were not in the trial, and obviously a lot of things in the trial that they couldn't reflect in the movie. But I did mention that when it came time the next day for William Jennings Bryan to interview Darrow completely undercut that whole plan by, as soon as the judge came in, Darrow said, we have no closing argument. And by not giving a closing argument, that cut off the possibility of Jennings Bryan interviewing Darrow, which pissed him off royally, as you can imagine. So he was just very furious. At any rate, fun stuff that went on.
I love the drama behind the film.
Huge drama. I mean,
Yeah.
The actual Scopes trial was so much more dramatic than even Inherit the Wind, which is a wonderful play. It really is.
So why has
There,
no one redone that in all these years to actually make a more representative version?
who knows?
Rhetorical question, but
Yeah.
yeah.
But if you want to read more, I really strongly recommend that people who want to learn more about this, there's a wonderful book by Edward Larson called Summer for the Gods. And it won a Pulitzer when it was written back in the
Ooh,
90s or something. I should know when Ed's book was written. Um,
yeah.
but
1997.
thank you very much. I
Yeah.
didn't forget that much of it, I guess. Summer for the Gods. Really, really good book. It's a page turner, crazily enough. You start reading, think, whoa, this is what happened next. And the cast of characters was really extraordinary. I talked a little bit about this in the Skeptical conference that Kara went to. That one of Scopes's attorneys was this very quirky Tennessee lawyer. And of course, they did have to have local counsel. It couldn't just be the ACLU coming in, bringing their own people. They had to have local counsel. And this guy shows up literally on Scope's doorstep and says, "Boy, you may not want me for your lawyer, but I'm going to be here." And Scopes was a little bit intimidated, as one might expect. But that lawyer, whose name was Randolph Neal, also had been sacked by the University of Tennessee Law School because he didn't do things quite in the academic fashion. He didn't bother grading his students' tests or papers. He just thought that was a colossal bore. Gave everybody 95%. Students loved him, you can tell. And he skipped classes sometimes. And when he was there, half the time he wouldn't bother actually teaching law. He would instead just BS about, current events. And he also didn't bathe very often. So he was a bit of a character, shall we say.
So
And
I'm
there are
looking
plenty
at
of
the
other
poll
characters.
questions, and I don't feel too bad because number three, which is the following closest to the truth, most people thought the same way I did, which turns out not to be true. So let's talk about that one a little bit.
Oh, yeah. Here are the results. Question number 3 was which of the following is closer to the truth? And the majority of people, 54%, said that they believed it was because Scopes wanted students to learn evolution. So that's why he broke the law.
Which was
And
the way I recall being presented in the film.
yeah,
That's the film, not the trial.
yeah. So what would you say is closer to the actual reason?
The community leaders wanted to bring commerce to Dayton.
Oh,
That
so they
blows my
wanted a
mind.
spectacle, basically.
They wanted, well, less of a spectacle than just an intellectual experience. But, Dayton, Tennessee, this is coal country. My NCSC colleague, Glenn Branch, and I drove around, and we actually went to a wonderful little coal museum talking about the coal industry back in the late 19th century and early 20th century. But the mines had kind of been played out, and the big industry would kind of close down around Dayton. It was the county seat. But it was losing population. There was a real concern on the part of the civic leaders that Dayton needed something to kind of get back to its more dominant role in central Tennessee. So when the Butler Act was passed, the ACLU, which was this little baby organization out of New York, it had only been around for 5 years. The ACLU took out ads in Tennessee newspapers that called for a plaintiff. If there is a teacher in Tennessee who would be willing to challenge the Butler Act, the ACLU would defend him free of cost. And so this was read by one of the local engineers / businessmen, a man named George Rappelier. And he thought, let's see what we can do. So we got together a bunch of his other civic leaders, and they said, did one of the teachers teach evolution? Could we provide this plaintiff? And that would bring commerce and people to Dayton, Tennessee, and we could have this wonderful Chautauqua event. Y'all know what Chautauquas are. These are these intellectual, very popular in the 19th century, and actually they're still going on in Ohio. We would have lectures and we would have seminars, and people would discuss the issues of the day, and it would be this wonderful humanistic intellectual experience. And so, did anybody teach evolution? Well, there's one high school in town, and the number of teachers is few, therefore, and the number of science teachers is also quite few. They didn't have a whole lot of choices. There were only a couple of people who taught science there at all. So they thought, well, how about that young fellow, John Scopes? He'd only been there a year. He taught physics and math. And so John Scopes was playing tennis at the time. And so they sent a runner to the tennis court to bring John back to the Robinson's drugstore where they were all meeting to discuss this issue. And they said, John, did you teach evolution? And he says, well, I don't know. I mean, I substituted for the biology teacher, during the review period. Biology teacher got sick for 3 weeks or something. And we reviewed the textbook, and the textbook includes evolution. So probably I taught evolution. Good enough for them. So,
Can you imagine being the face of something like that after having substituted for someone for a few weeks and you read part of the textbook? Oh my goodness, the anxiety.
Maybe. And of course, what they had to do is they had to arraign Scopes, number one. And so they ran and got a justice of the peace, and the justice of the peace, signed the arraignment and they gave it to the constable, whom they also invited to the thing. The constable served Scopes with his arraignment, and everybody said, okay, you can go back to your tennis game now. And he did. He went back to, so it was a most cordial arraignment, shall we say, as opposed to Inherit the Wind, where the Scopes character was literally hauled off to jail out of his classroom. It was very, very, very dramatic. The actual arraignment of the real Scopes was actually fairly amusing.
I am shocked, Eugenie. I'm telling you, I cannot. Now I'm not going to be able to believe any movie I see anymore for the first time ever.
That's actually not a bad idea, Rob. Movies are fiction.
Did you watch Fargo? Did you ever see Fargo? It starts with every word in this film is true. We have actually changed the name of every victim here so that they aren't found out. ... They go on for 5 minutes with the display on the screen about this. And then I find out none of it is real. It is not even based on a true story.
I've had people argue with me on the basis of a film that they saw about this is how we know that alien encounters are real. Like, didn't you see Close Encounters of the Third Kind? Like, as if that is actual evidence for their experience. Like, it happens, it gets into your brain, and then you can't remember if Clark Gable was in it or not.
Exactly.
That's funny. And so, you mentioned something interesting earlier, Jeannie. You said that at the time that this film came out, yes, it's a controversy about a trial about evolution and religion, but kind of the theme it was speaking to when it came out had more to do with McCarthyism and that era and politics. Do you think that if the movie were to be, or the play were to be rewritten today, that the narrative would change? And how do you think it would be represented or received if we were to see a similar representation of this court case now?
I don't know. I think it's highly unlikely that it would happen because there is Inherit the Wind, and the play is great. I think the play won awards, but then they made a movie out of it with what's his name, that wonderful actor. Somebody will look it up and stick it in the chat, because that's what happens in these things. Anyway, that movie is on everybody's 100 best films list. I mean, it is extremely.
Spencer Tracy.
Thank you very much. I knew somebody would. It is such a wonderful movie. And even though not very many people, I think fewer people see it today than, saw it 20 years ago, which happens. It is just an outstanding movie. And so why would anybody remake it, in a sense? And worse yet, it is the image of the Scopes trial that occurs in Inherit the Wind that's kind of conditioned everybody's opinions. Even, somebody as well educated as Rob, kind of thought the real Scopes trial was Inherit the Wind. So if
I saw it on TV, why would it be fake?
They don't let people think. They don't let people put stuff on television if it's fake. I mean, goodness knows. But I have a feeling if you were to remake it, people would say, oh, no, that's not the real Scopes trial. The real Scopes trial, John Scopes was hauled out of his classroom by the vigilante.
That is a very good point. Yes. All right. So I looked ahead at the last question on the poll. I am quite shocked at how few people watching us live here have seen this. So 72% said no, they've never seen, and I'm not sure is 16. So it's almost 90-something% either haven't seen it or they're not sure if they've seen it. So let's transition this talk to about the conference that you went to basically commemorate the actual event, regardless of the film. And like, so what happened at this commemoration? What went on there?
Well, this was, in fact, the third commemoration of the Scopes trial. My friend and former colleague, Glenn Branch, and I basically did a total geek out on Scopes in the middle of July in Tennessee. What could go wrong? It was about 95 degrees the whole week, by the way. The first weekend was actually an academic symposium at Vanderbilt University, which was wonderful. I basically took a look at all the people that were going to be at Vanderbilt, and I thought, God, there's so many friends of mine here. I mean, plus two of the people who were speakers at Vanderbilt were our expert witnesses from Kitzmiller, Ken Miller and Barbara Forrest. And so basically the Kitzmiller gang, the legal team, decided that we would do our 20th reunion in Nashville at the Vanderbilt Symposium. So, we just had this wonderful Kitzmiller reunion plus Scopes Geek Out #1. Wonderful speakers. I would encourage anybody who's interested in the Scopes trial to just Google Vanderbilt Scopes Symposium, because they put all of the videos of the talks online, and they are wonderful. Really good scientists, really good historians, a lot of good people speaking. After we left the Vanderbilt Symposium, we went to Dayton because the Ray County Historical Society, there's someone here in the audience, we were talking earlier, who had attended one of the Ray County Historical Society's reenactments of the Scopes trial in the Ray County Courthouse, which is, I think that would be a blast. But they had their own Scopes commemoration, which was a very interesting experience. One of the things that happened after the Scopes trial is that William Jennings Bryan died, and there was this great outpouring of grief about his death, because he was extremely beloved in America in general, but especially in the conservative Christian community. And so a bunch of his supporters gathered the money to found a college in his honor in Dayton, Tennessee, and it's called Bryan College. And it is a young earth creationist university. I actually visited Bryan College. It's quite a lovely little place. I would not encourage people to go there. I'm sure they do well in some things, but when it comes to history and science, not so much. But anyway, they actually had some professors from Bryan College speaking at the Dayton Symposium, which was very interesting indeed. And then the third helping of Scopes commemoration was the CFI FFRI conference that you brought up, which we're going to talk about, which was in Chattanooga the following weekend. So there was Scopesapalooza that whole week.
So what names that people might recognize attended that?
Well, because I went through 3 conferences and they kind of blur at some points, I have a cheat sheet. Right? Dan and Annie Laurie Gaylor, who of course are well known in this community. From CFI, of course, Robin Blumner, who is the executive director. Chris Cameron, who is North Carolina African American religious and intellectual history. Zenos Fridakis, who is the wonderful sculptor who produced a statue of Clarence Darrow. We were talking before the live session about how for a very, very long time, there had been a statue of William Jennings Bryan in the yard of the courthouse. And as you see, it's kind of wooden. I mean, it's bronze, but it's wooden in terms of its presentation. It's really a pretty terrible statue. As opposed to, this is a statue of Clarence Darrow, which was done by Zenos Fridakis, a sculptor. And, just look at the detail on that. He's holding one of his suspenders with his left hand and pointing with his right hand. I mean, it's just a truly magnificent job of art. It's really quite wonderful. So anyway, back to the real world here. He was there as well, and he talked about the statue, and it was quite lovely to hear him speak. Ed Larson, the historian that I mentioned to you, who is the preeminent historian of the Scopes trial, in my opinion. Bertha Vasquez, who is an educator who works for CFI, and she has their TIES program, which is a program about the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science.
So Bertha did a talk for us not that long ago.
Yes.
Oh yeah, Bertha's great. Bertha's terrific. She gave an excellent talk. She really did.
Mm-hmm.
And the historian Brenda Wineapple, who has written another book about the Scopes trial. And another good reason for me to go to the CFI, the Chattanooga one, two individuals from my trial, as it were, from the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial, the lawyer Richard Katzke, who was working at the time for Americans United for Separation of Church and State. He has since gone on to other things, but a very, very good friend and an excellent lawyer. And Judge John Jones, who was the judge in Kitzmiller versus Dover. And I had not seen John for many, many years. So I really had to go to all three of these conferences. That was all there is to it. And the other person who was at the Chattanooga conference was John Delancey, the actor who is best known for playing Q in the Star Trek series, because I should back up a little bit. It's the 100th anniversary of the Scopes trial. It's the 20th anniversary of Kitzmiller versus Dover, 1925, 2005, 2025. And so they did sort of a little hybrid of the Scopes trial and Kitzmiller, which actually also the people at Vanderbilt did. They also had a section on the Dover trial as well. But Delancey has written he and a colleague, Kristen, here I go again. What is Kristen's last name? Lovely woman. She's a screenwriter. Delancey teamed up with a screenwriter to write a radio play
Kristen
about
Traeger,
thank you, Traeger, to write a radio play about the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial. And you shop these things for quite a while before you commercialize it. But he's performed it in a couple of places. I saw it in Sacramento last year when he came up to perform it with the California Free Thought Day ceremony, which was a great deal of fun. That's when I met him, and that was really fun.
I'm going to put a link in the chat. I found an article on the web about that. It's Scope Centennial, the Dover Panda Trial, reading with John Delancey.
Oh,
So
very cool.
About this.
Now, for people who are not familiar, could you tell us a little bit about the Kitzmiller trial and how that fits into the story here?
Absolutely. Kitzmiller versus Dover was a trial held in federal district court in the central part of Pennsylvania about a policy that a local school board had passed, which would require teachers to teach intelligent design. Now, intelligent design is just a sort of a frou-frou version of creation science, quite honestly. It tries to avoid the obvious legal pitfalls of creation science by leaving out obvious references to religion. They don't talk about Noah's flood. They don't talk about Adam and Eve, but they do talk a lot about some fairly hand-wavy stuff about information theory and the improbability of complicated structures being produced by natural selection. So it's a very narrow kind of slice, but the same arguments are found in creation science. So teachers didn't want to teach it. A lot of parents in the community didn't want to have it. And we got together with them and we helped to form a legal team with Americans United for Separation of Church and State, the ACLU, and Pepper Hamilton, which is a large Philadelphia law firm. The ACLU usually partners with a commercial law firm because they don't have the staff to do as many things as they want to do. And my organization that I used to work for, the National Center for Science Education, advised the plaintiff's legal team on intelligent design, on religious issues, on historical aspects, on scientific aspects, everything but the law. They knew the law. We knew everything else. And actually, the lawyers from Pepper Hamilton and others have been very generous in publicly stating on more than one occasion that, quote, they couldn't have tried this case without us, which makes us feel very warm and fuzzy because we all just worked our little butts off on this. I've often told people, going to court is the last thing you want to do. Try to solve these problems behind the scenes. And we did. We worked all through the school year, all through the summer when this big blow up took place with the passing of the policy and the fight over textbooks and all of that kind of stuff. And we worked with the teachers and advised and tried to figure out ways. The teachers tried to figure out ways to compromise with the board so that they could teach science with integrity without teaching this foolishness. But the board just steamrolled them. They just, we got the upper hand. We have the majority. You have to do what we say. So there. And so there was no resource, nothing they could do except to sue. And so plaintiffs, and including some teachers, sued the district, and that became Kitzmiller versus Dover. The good news is that the Kitzmiller trial, which was a full trial, hey, Darrow didn't get to have expert witnesses. We sure did. And our expert witnesses were fabulous. We just really out-witnessed and out-lawyered them from day one. We had excellent scientists who knew a lot about intelligent design. Even our theologian that we brought in, he knew a lot about intelligent design because theologians don't like it either. This was a fellow whose area of theology is science and religion. And he also knew a lot about the nature of science and how intelligent design was not following the rules of basically naturalism, materialist naturalism. So, all of our witnesses were on the same page that if you bring God into your explanation, you are not doing science. And fundamentally, the intelligent design position does bring God in, although they try to smuggle it in by not identifying the designer. But once you read their stuff, you learn very, very quickly that the only way, the only designer that would have been able to produce things like the bacterial flagellum or the vertebrate eye or the other complex structures, the only designer that would have been possible is a supernatural designer, and he spells his name with 3 letters. So we were able to convince Judge John Jones that intelligent design was just a form of creation science. The Supreme Court previously had ruled back in 1979, late 80s, excuse me, that creation science was unconstitutional to teach in public schools. Therefore, since intelligent design was creation science, it was not legitimate to teach it in the public schools either. And the judge wrote this wonderful, wonderful legal decision that's just beautiful to read, which, struck down the policy. And frankly, we were very glad of that because at NCSC, we had been tracking the states that were very intelligent design friendly in the sense that they had submitted legislation previously to the Kitzmiller trial. And we figured that if the judge had decided that Kitzmiller was legal to teach, boy, those folks would be back with a vengeance. And we would just have little Dovers all over the country. But the judge stomped intelligent design pretty hard. And the intelligent design people pretty much, licked their wounds and went home and gave up. I mean, there were a couple of little flurries in the next couple of years of trying to get legislation to promote intelligent design. But by and large, they just gave up trying to get themselves into school. So big, whew, we didn't want to have that fight.
Well, and I just want to pause and reflect on how important that was that you did that and that y'all got together and fought that, because even though that was, a case that was brought at one particular school, that is exactly your point. As soon as that gets allowed, it's going to be everywhere. And I was in high school a little bit before that took place, but we had that textbook in our school. It was not a public school. I went
of
to
Pandas and People, really?
Yes, we had Of Pandas and People in the 90s in the middle school. It was a private school. It wasn't, well, here's the rub. It was accredited in the state of Texas, where basically for that to happen, the students would have to take some kind of standardized testing every year to show that they're, progressing along appropriate standards.
Right.
And apparently we continuously were getting bad scores in the science section of that. We had been using the Bob Jones University science curriculum, which is as bad or worse. And then they picked up Of Pandas and People for the middle school kids, or whenever they did the biology class. That was what they started using, because that was the more rigorous text. So
that is a step up from Bob Jones, actually, but it's still terrible.
Yeah. And so, I mean, the fact that you were fighting this was important, because there were schools, I was in a school that was using that book thinking that passed for rigorous science. And it does not, in case anyone was wondering.
Yeah.
But that matters that you got that out of there, because that is bonkers. So thank you for doing that.
It can come back. Leonard Tramiel had a little note in the chat, which I want to underscore. We won big time at the federal district court level. But by the time that the case was argued and the decision came down, the good citizens of Dover had voted the rascals out. And there was almost an entirely new school board that had been elected the fall of of our trial, actually. And so the new school board was completely uninterested in appealing. So Dover is precedent only in the Middle District of Tennessee, which is not a very big district, but it is such a strong decision that I think anybody contemplating doing it over would be very discouraged at the thought of having to go through a trial like we put on, because we really put on a very good trial. The transcripts are all up on the NCSE website, and there's a lot of science in there. There was a really good article that came out in the New Yorker that was titled something like "The Biology Class You Wish You Could Have Taken," because there's so much science that we did. But don't get me started on Dover, because I can bore you for hours on Dover. But we
I
had
do
to
have a
think
few more
very
questions about
carefully.
that, Eugenie, but I would
Pardon me?
like to talk about your participation in the plight of the Dover case.
That was fun.
Yeah.
So
That
you
was
said,
fun.
so John Delancey co-wrote a play, and you guys performed it there live at the, and how did you get involved with being an actress?
Well, I had run into John on the streets of Dayton.
Did he just appear
Glen,
out of nowhere in front of you? No, never mind.
basically, yeah. It's a small town, and we were attending I know this was actually the day before the Dayton symposium started, and Glenn and I had come to town, and he had come to Chattanooga early because he was rehearsing his players, and he and Kristen had come to Dayton just to see, because this is their chance to see Dayton, right? And the day off, so to speak. And we were literally walking down the street, and there's John, and I went, and he went, ah. So we had a big reunion on the street. And he was telling me what he does is whether it's at Sacramento or Chattanooga or wherever he's performing the radio play, he gets local actors to be the characters. And it's a really big cast. I mean, he's got expert witnesses, he's got fact witnesses, he's got lawyers and narrators, and, it just goes on and on. There's probably more than 20 people in the cast, which is a big cast. So he's not going to haul it around from town to town. He uses local actors. And I said, so how are rehearsals going? And he said, well, I haven't decided on the Barbara Forrest character. And I me and my big mouth, I says, well, you have to understand that Barbara Forrest is very Southern and she's very sweet, but she also is very, very smart. And she doesn't let anybody get by with anything. And he said, would you be Barbara Forrest?
Oh, you auditioned for the role.
Apparently, I auditioned on the streets
Well
of Dayton.
done.
Well, and I did it as a joke, and I said, I'm not an actor, I mean, look, I did a couple of plays in college. That does not make me an actor, So he said, no, I'll get back to you. So we changed phone numbers and all that sort of, and I didn't hear from him, so I didn't think anything about it. And then, like, it might have been Saturday or very late Friday, something like that. He sent me a text saying, you in?
The weekend of the conference?
Oh, yeah. This was, I think it was even Saturday. He said, you in? I said, oh, sure. What the heck? Why not? I mean, there was one rehearsal before the actual performance. And I said, well, I really like to come to that one. He said, that's a good idea. So I showed up for that rehearsal, and he introduced me. He said, this is Eugenie Scott. She had participated in the Kitzmiller trial, and she's going to be playing Barbara Forrest tonight. And I said, thank you for letting me be in your play as a non-actor. I said, this is the small pond in which I am a big fish, and the people in your audience are going to get a big kick out of seeing me in this. And so we're going to sort of tuck me over in the corner where I can't be seen. And I actually was behind one of the other speakers. So nobody really knew that I was on stage. And I sneaked off. And when everybody's attention, it's like magic, right? Everybody's attention was looking at the actors coming in on stage right. I slipped off and came up the stairs and sat down on stage left. So we played it very cagey. And then when it actually came time for me to stand up and take the witness chair, so to speak, to read my words, there was this kind of people.
Is that Eugenie up there? What is she doing on this stage?
A lot of fun. It was really a lot of fun. And I did at least a partial Barbara Forrest impression, and that got people laughing too. So I think people enjoyed the fact that I was in the cast, even though my part was very small necessarily.
So who is Barbara Forrest? What was her role?
Oh, I'm sorry. Barbara Forrest was one of our expert witnesses. She was the historian. Actually, she's a philosopher of science, but she functioned as a historian of intelligent design. She'd written a book on the history of intelligent design called Creationism's Trojan Horse. Very good book, by the way. And John's radio play does mention that accurately, that Barbara was the expert witness that the intelligent design people tried their damnedest to get struck, as she was the person they did not want on the witness stand, because she just had the goods on these people. She had so much detail about the history of intelligent design, and she could tie it specifically and precisely to creation science, which is the last thing they wanted, because their lawyers also knew that if they're tied to creation science, they lose. And she did it, and they did. So yeah, Barbara was extremely important in our trial.
Yeah, it's just interesting to me. This is the second time, and comparing both of these trials, the Scopes trial and now this trial, where the whole thing hinged on trying to make sure that experts weren't allowed to testify, because if they did, they would reveal that this is not good science. This is not science. It's interesting to me that people persisted in that argument rather than thinking to themselves, if we have to prevent experts from testifying against us and there aren't any experts on our side, I wonder if this is a problem with the belief that I'm putting out here. But,
well, in the case
wondering.
of Kitzmiller, there's some wonderful stories about the expert witnesses for Kitzmiller, too. They did have expert witnesses in Kitzmiller, but they had a very seriously reduced number of expert witnesses. I think they ended up with only 3.
Eugenie, I'm interested in what part of the trial as Barbara did you have to play? Like, were you grilled before you would get on the stand? Did they have you testifying? Like, what did you do?
Oh, as I was playing Barbara? It's a radio play. So I would sit in what was the witness chair, and the actor who was playing one of the defense lawyers grilled me, asked 3 or 4 questions. Obviously, one of the things that John and Kristen had to do when they wrote this play is reduce an awful lot of testimony to essentials and make it entertaining as well. And scientists tend to go on and on and on. So they really had to chew up a lot of the science testimony. With Barbara's, I was so sad that I didn't actually hear Barbara's testimony because I had a speaking engagement and I couldn't go to the trial that day. But John and Kirsten clearly had to reduce Barbara's testimony as well. So they just sort of gave a little flavor of the sort of thing. Like the first question that the lawyer asks was, "Are you a card-carrying member of the ACLU?" kind of thing.
So you had her accent down, though. So you at some time heard her speak, even though you didn't.
Oh, no, she's a good friend of mine.
Oh, okay.
Forever. Oh, no, Barbara's
You left that part out.
No, Barbara and I go way back. I mean, we go back to the 90s at least, and she was on my board too.
Does she know? Did you tell her that you played her in this play?
We have a Kitzmiller listserv, and I sent a message, but for some reason it didn't go through, and I just got too busy, and I need to do that. Thanks for reminding me.
But you could just send her this recording with.
Well, I don't really do a Southern Louisiana accent. It's sort of a combination of Texas and knowing Barbara for a long time and loving her accent. But, there are no recordings of it, so that's perfectly fine. No, I mean, they're still editing. They're still working. They'll be tinkering with the script for a while.
Were you telling me, I think Susan was there, right? Susan Gerbeck. She didn't record. She records everything that she goes to.
People were asked to not record.
Oh.
Firmly asked.
Okay.
Firmly asked to not record either visuals, or you could take stills. I took a bunch of stills, sent them to the cast. The cast was quite pleased about that because, of course, nobody was taking stills of them. But
so besides John Delancey writing this, did he actually have a role? Did he play a part in it?
Yes, he did. Usually in the play, John plays the role of Judge Jones. And there's some reading from transcripts from the trial. His Judge Jones part comes up at the end, and he's a good actor. When he reads the Jones lines, they're really good. But they're lines that Jones wrote, but he still speaks them very well. Now, what was really fun with this particular performance in Chattanooga is that John Jones was there. And actually, when I ran into John in the streets of Dayton on the Tuesday before the Saturday of the conference, I don't know which of us brought it up, but I said, boy, it would really be great if you could get John Jones to read those lines. Because remember, I had seen Delancey's play in Sacramento a number of months ago. So I knew that there was this part where there are quotations from the decision that were part of the play. And usually Delancey read them. But I said, wouldn't it be really, and he said, oh, yeah, but I couldn't ask that. I said, sure you can. I said, I'll ask him for you if you want, because I got to know Judge Jones after the trial. We were both on the speaking circuit, and we would end up sometime at the same conferences, and so we got to know each other.
So he got to play himself in this radio.
Yes, that was so much fun. So he agreed, and John read some of the Judge Jones part, but the very final statement from the play is this very stirring piece that John Jones wrote that John himself just got up and read, and it was just fabulous. It was so terrific. I actually, since I'm in the mood for sharing.
All right, so just so I get this straight, the role of Judge Jones was mostly played by Delancey, but then at the end they switched so that the person played himself.
Correct.
I gotta have a Star Trek moment here. I would be picturing Q in Counter at Farpoint as the judge of mankind whenever John Delancey is reading anything as a judge. I just
Oh my goodness, please tell me that that's how it went.
Nope. This is Delancey playing Judge Jones for part of the trial. One of
we
the
didn't have the fancy Star Trek hat on, so
he doesn't have does not have a fancy Star Trek hat. But this
I'm
actually was
sorry, I can't take that seriously without his hat
with
on.
his
He
crazy
is
hat.
not
the
the
judge's
judge
hat from
of
Counter at
humanity.
Farpoint.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I love that. This is so much fun. I had no idea this was even a thing that happened.
And then we have, and this is the real judge reading his lines at the end of the play, and it was really quite
Wow.
quite great. It was really fun.
That had to be stirring.
Yeah, it was great. And I tell you, it just totally brought down the house. I assure you, everybody was just went, whoa, because, that was a surprise too. I mean, I was a little surprised, but bringing John Jones out was a big surprise. Nobody anticipated that. It was a nice little bit of theater, as they'd say in the biz.
I love it. It was literally a piece of theater, yeah.
So somebody else who
Exactly.
apparently was there has a comment. His voice, I guess meaning John Delancey's voice, easily made up for the lack of a hat.
Yeah, he's got a great voice. He really does.
That's fair. That's
Yeah.
fair. I'll take it. All right. Well, we've probably got time for a few more discussion topics. Rob, I know you prepared some other items for us to go over. What should we cover? We have so much to go over with Jeannie. There's so much. You
Well,
do
yeah,
everything.
this might be more of a downer though. Yeah, so you addressed us last 19 months ago, and people can look this up. The title of your talk now on YouTube is Why We Still Have to Worry About the Creationists.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And you talk quite a bit about Lemon versus Kurtzman being overturned essentially,
Right.
for the Kennedy versus Bremerton case, where people don't know this publicly praying football coach won at the Supreme Court level that it was just fine. Was there anything wrong with that? And a transition to U.S. laws towards using history and tradition as the guiding legal principle instead of the Lemon case and Establishment Clause.
Yeah.
So now it's almost 2 years later. What do you think's been happening? Is it getting as bad as I think it's been getting?
Yep. It's just as bad. And it's worse, actually, because there have been the version of the Scopes talk that Kara heard is one where I emphasized one thing. A version of it that I gave to NCSE last week emphasized this part. So eventually NCSE will post it up. And, those of you who are interested in this part might want to check that. Skip through the beginning. But what happened the last several years, there have been a number of state legislature bills that have come up that basically is a smorgasbord of possibilities for creationism. There have been some bills coming up that literally say, we're going to teach creationism or we're going to teach intelligent design. There are bills that have come up that have said, well, teach evolution, but teach the strengths and weaknesses of evolution, which actually doesn't have a legal position. But certainly that teach creationism and teach intelligent design, those have been decided. I mean, those have been to court and they have lost. And there's also a new decision on the road now that we have to take into consideration. And that is Mahmoud versus Taylor, which was just earlier this year, in fact, a month or so ago. The Mahmoud case is the case about allowing parents to opt out their kids for LGBTQ elementary school books. Now, this actually is not a decision. This was one of those procedural things where eventually this case is going to come back and the Supremes are going to rule on it. But right now they removed an injunction or put whatever the hell it is. But this isn't a final decision. But
Wait, so
what
what
it
was the
does
initial
is,
decision? It was that a parent could say, I'm not going to have my child use that textbook?
yep. It's not a textbook. These were elementary school reading books. And one of the things that has been happening in the last several years is a bunch of bills have been proposed that are called parental rights bills. And what they do is allow parents to opt their kids out when there's a topic that the parents don't like for religious reasons. And Mahmoud was kind of the first chance that the Supremes have had to rule on this. Now, other lower district courts have ruled in some of these cases, ruling what we would consider the right way, which is no, this is an establishment of religion issue. But because the Kennedy decision did remove the precedent that has been used since the 1970s to decide Establishment Clause cases. And so it's history and tradition. There's no real firm guidance on how Establishment Clause cases are going to be decided in the future. There's no precedent like Lemon was. So these parental rights bills had been dismissed or struck down by courts when they had Lemon, but not so much anymore. What do we do now? With the Mahmoud case, we can kind of see where the Supreme Court is leaning, and where they are leaning is toward letting parents opt out for religious reasons. Now, this is not directly parallel to something like a creationism and evolution class, but Sotomayor wrote a wonderful dissent. Sotomayor's dissent to Mahmoud should be read. It's really strong. And she brought up the point that what is to prevent academic subjects from also being subjected to this kind of opting out? And she used evolution as an example. Or people who don't want their kids to learn about vaccines. Maybe they can opt out instead of learning about vaccines. Maybe they're misogynists and they don't want to learn about Marie Curie. So Sotomayor at least brought up the possibility that this might be applied to academic subjects and not just elementary school reading books.
Well, and I don't think that's at all a distant possibility. That those are all things that I'm sure would have been objected to by the people that were in charge of my education as an elementary school and middle school student. Any of those things. I mean, these are things that if people are deciding what they want their children to learn based on their religious fundamentalism, those are all topics that they likely don't want their children to learn about. This is not like a slippery slope type of argument. I can go to a family reunion right now and find you several people that would object to any number of those things being taught.
All that woke stuff, that like climate change and all that. Yeah.
Well, this, of course, gets back to one of the major themes of the Scopes trial, because the position of the prosecution in Scopes, the William Jennings Bryan side, was that the state had the right to tell teachers what to teach because the state paid for education, and so the teacher just should do what the state tells them to do. The ACLU Scopes side, the defense side, made the argument that the teachers should have academic freedom to teach what they consider to be good science in this case, or good. In the United States, it's actually a kind of compromise between those two extremes. There is a very good reason not to give K-12 teachers full academic freedom, because you don't want Mr. Brown in school A teaching this and Mr. Jones in school B teaching that, because you have to have a coherent curriculum across the district. So basically, when a teacher signs a contract with the district, the teacher agrees to teach that district's curriculum. The academic freedom comes in how that is taught and specifics of instruction. That is where a teacher has academic freedom. But American teachers do not have academic freedom to just teach any old thing they want. And we don't actually want them to do that. 20, 25 years ago, a whole lot more of them would have been teaching creationism. Now it's much lower. But yeah, between Kennedy and Mahmoud, I think that we could be open to a lot more legislation compromising the teaching of evolution.
So does Project 2025 have anything in it specifically that addresses this issue to try to get creationism taught and evolution not?
I don't know of it. I have not read the whole book, and nobody's brought it up. And I suspect somebody would have if evolution was specific. I don't know. I can't say.
Okay.
Well, we're getting close to time to do Q&A, but Rob, is there anything else we should talk about, or Jeannie, that we should discuss on this topic before we go to questions and answers?
Yeah, the last thing I kind of asked was because I wanted to ask about something you did last time, and I'm wondering, because it's been almost 2 years, the administration clearly, even though they denied it, wants to implement whatever is in Project 2025. And maybe this specific topic isn't in there specifically, but they certainly are, anti-science in a lot of ways. But you see that happening to cuts in departments and things like that.
Yeah.
Demands to not allow certain language in official documents. So I'm wondering if one of the things you showed last time was Google Trends regarding searching the term creationism. I think it was creationism or intelligent design, one of those two. And it was going down, and we even used the term, it looks like it's flatlining. Have you noticed anything anything about that being on the uptick now because the religious right, has gotten this power?
I have not done a search since. And these trends are slow. It takes a while. But the opting out thing is very popular and it seems to be very fair. So I think I'm quite worried about that. I'm worried, obviously, about the demise of Lemon versus Kurtzman, clearly. But that's across the board. There's just all kinds of awful.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things Project 2025 has done directly or indirectly is this whole Ten Commandments thing in Texas. I don't know if it's directly connected or now people just feel empowered to
Yeah.
bring these cases and have these things done. So I'm worried about that too.
Well, the interesting thing about the Ten Commandments posting is that that's actually very divisive because which version of the Ten Commandments do you use? Because Catholics have a different one than do Protestants. There's the King James Version, which is the one that's sort of the default. That's the one they tend to put up. But there are scholars who research the Bible and how it was written and what it means and like that. And so you get different Bibles other than King James that have different.
So someone has to school me on this. I was raised Catholic and I did not know. Are you just talking about the words in each of the 10 are different,
Yeah,
or do they
yeah.
drop out one and they have a different commandment?
The order is different in some cases. I actually remember the last couple of weeks regarding this Texas posting that there was a complaint from a parent. We really shouldn't be posting that stuff about adultery because what if the children ask about adultery? How do we, what do we?
Right.
And I just had to laugh because I remember when I was in elementary school and I was in Sunday school and we were talking about the Ten Commandments. And for thou shalt not commit adultery, there was this picture of this fellow looking very furtive. And there was this big tub of milk and he was pouring water in the milk. He was adulterating the milk.
Oh, wow.
What?
Pretty sure that's not what it means.
But now that I know, I find completely hilarious because what do you tell elementary age children about thou shalt not commit adultery? Well, you shouldn't water down the milk. Okay.
They're going to be remembering that, though, like into adulthood. They are trusting you that you are educating them on real information. Like, I can't remember if I mentioned this the last time you were on, Jeannie. You'll love this as a biological anthropologist. I was a teaching assistant in a forensic anthropology class in grad school when I learned that, men and women actually typically have the same number of ribs. It is not the case that men are missing one rib on one side because that's what God used to create women. Like, I was going through life thinking that.
Yeah.
Like, I had stopped believing the biblical account, but they had taught that to us all the way through school as if, this is just yet another proof that the Bible is real because, how men are missing one rib compared to women. And I was just walking
that would be
around with
such an
that for
obvious thing.
decades.
It would be such an obvious thing to fact check. Why would they lie about that? Because you could clearly fact check it. So it must be
Right. It just never occurred to me to fact check that because they had taught it so matter of factly and they smuggled it in as oh yes, yet another proof of how we know the Bible is true is that, people have these different number of ribs. And I was just walking around thinking that was real.
Wow.
So yeah, you got to be careful what you're telling kids about these stories because that is going to stick with them.
Did you know what the word species meant?
Oh, we had a whole thing about that. Remember, we didn't believe in biology at our school. We were taught
so
that
explains
meant
that explains my fundamentalist friend at the age of 50 who said something about men and women are different species, right?
Oh,
No,
yeah. Oh my
goodness. That's idiosyncratic. That's not part of the canon. But one of the things you mentioned, Project 2025, one of the issues that you touched upon, but we should underscore, this is not a document that's very positive about public education. They don't get into specifics like, do we axe evolution? Do we axe this or that so much as they basically just want to do in the Department of Education, for example. They want to get the government out of the education business. And of course, as public school education withers, that means that vouchers and private school education is going to thrive. And of course, I always try to point out to people that when you talk about school choice, what you are saying is that the school chooses because you don't get to go to any private school you want to. You might have a voucher, but the school doesn't have to take you. If you're a behavioral problem, or if you need a wheelchair, or if you have a learning disability or a speech disability, they don't have to take you. If you're not the right color, they don't have to take you. School choice means the school chooses. And it would be nice to help people understand that because they are being sold a bill of goods that vouchers are a way of parents deciding the education of their children. Nuh-uh.
Those schools
But of
can
course, if you
admit whoever
destroy
they
public
want.
school education, then all you have left is private schools, which is their goal.
Oh, absolutely. Because then the private schools can teach whatever they want.
Yeah. And you will have a remnant public school system, but it'll just take all the misfits and the has-beens and the crippled kids and the minorities, and they won't do very well. Who knew? But I
Exactly.
digress.
Yeah. No, well, we've got loads of good questions and answers for you, but is there anything else that y'all want to talk about before we move on to? Oh, you know what? Actually, let me ask to kind of point us in a direction. You've, of course, been involved in opposing these kinds of things in the past. Do you have any advice for people for what they can do to not just watch all of this unfold, but how can we be involved in making sure that schools are teaching science accurately?
Well, all politics is local, all education is local. If you have kids or grandkids, be supportive of local teachers. If you have the opportunity, this works better, of course, if you do have kids in the public school systems. When you go to the back to school night, Mrs. Brown, we're so glad that Paloma is in your class this year. And I know that she's going to have a wonderful year. And she's really interested in science. And I really hope that you can spend some time on helping her learn about science and how it works, because it's such an important thing. The teachers just eat that up. They just love this sort of thing. And, if things go well, just say, and, it's really important that climate change and evolution be taught to children too. And, we're behind you 100% when you teach this. Put it in the frame that, yes, I know that the teacher's going to teach this and we'll back you. Don't threaten teachers. They get threatened enough as it is. They don't need to be threatened, but they do need support. They need to know that the parents and members of the community have their back. Letters to the editor will help. If you can't go to back to school night, that's the most effective. But letters to the editor, we really support our local teachers, and find out what your local state standards say. In most cases, evolution and climate change are somewhere in the state standards. Evolution is going to be in biology. Climate change is going to be sometimes in chemistry, sometimes in biology, sometimes in earth sciences. Climate change can be found all over the place. It can even be found in the social sciences. And more states are getting into legislation that require the teachers to pay attention to climate change. So support your local teacher, as it were, and vote for the good ones. I mean, the good school board members who are going to support science and support the kinds of subjects we want to have taught without compromise.
That's good advice. I'm glad to hear. Maybe there's hope. And
There's
there are
always
things we can do.
there's
Yeah,
always hope.
absolutely. All right. Well, are we ready to go to questions?
I can take a few questions, but I have a family that is waiting to be fed. So
Okay, let's do a few questions. We'll do speed round questions. Rob, what should we start with?
Yeah, I liked that last one. So, what in your experience do laymen most misunderstand about evolution, even if not raised to believe in creationism?
man evolved from monkeys.
Yeah, so I don't know if you've noticed my shirt.
No,
Ooh, what
I
does
can't
that say?
If we came from monkeys, then why are there still monkeys?
take
It
that
was
route.
me.
Yes, exactly.
Dawkins was the featured speaker. This was about 5 or 6 years ago, and I had this custom made. And he looked at it and he said, "Oh, very funny."
I have some Dawkins story about his sense of humor, but I will not share them.
Yeah, I actually also asked him. I took with me the Dawkins Delusion, which was a book written, of course, against the God delusion. And I asked him, "Can you could sign this? Put anything you want in it. I will not deign to put my name to that piece of trash."
Yeah.
Amazing. Amazing.
So
That
yeah,
book
it's
lives
not
in,
autographed.
yeah, my mom has
No,
given me
actually,
that book.
that was the question I got more than any other. If man evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys?
And
And of
what do you say
course,
when you're asked that?
I say that, well, that's not how evolution works. Evolution is a branching and splitting of lineages rather than a straight line of one creature evolving into another in a sequential fashion like that. So our closest relatives are actually Neanderthals, but the closest relatives to us and Neanderthals are another kind of hominid, Homo erectus, all of whom are extinct. But the closest relative of the human lineage is the chimpanzee lineage. The ancestry chimps and humans shared and monkeys shared is even further back. So chimpanzees are our cousins and monkeys are our very distant cousins. But you are not evolved from your cousin. We are not evolved from monkeys or ape or chimpanzees. You also have to be careful about apes because the word ape has a different meaning to people who know something about evolution than it does in the general public. To the general public, if you say, well, we didn't evolve from monkeys, we evolved from apes, you're not solving the problem. because when they think ape, they think chimpanzee. So now you're telling them that we didn't evolve from monkeys, we evolved from chimpanzees. That's also wrong.
And then they're just going to say, well, then why are there still chimpanzees? I mean,
Exactly.
this is like asking, well, if we have French bulldogs, why are there still coyotes?
Yeah, exactly. Or if the
Yeah.
United States came from Great Britain, why is Great Britain still there? Right, Nikki?
Yeah, it's a complete misunderstanding. That must be so frustrating. Okay, let's see. What else do we have? We got time for maybe one or two more questions, you think?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Someone is asking, do schools do enough teaching of the history of science so that students can see why, for example, special creation lost out to Darwin's theory? Or do you think that there should be more of a discussion of the history of science rather than just science itself?
I would love it if there were. I also know that in most cases, the curriculum is pretty crammed as it is. So I'm a little bit reluctant to lean harder on teachers who already have a zillion things to do. The curriculum varies enormously from one part of the country to another, and even within a state. Even though most school districts will adopt their state science standards or their state history standards or their state math standards, you still get a lot of variation from school to school or district to district as to how those standards are implemented, because standards are not curriculum. Standards just sort of give you the big overall picture. And the science standards I haven't read them all, but if they follow the national science standard recommendations, they do include things like history of science. But it's a desirable and a technique. You can help students understand science better by showing them how these ideas develop. And it's also a way of teaching students how science works and the process of science. Science is a way of knowing. And that is a place where it can be brought in. Yeah, history of science is a field that really helps you understand. But K-12, it's hard to get into much detail.
That's fair. I loved the drama when I had in my first semester of grad school in anthropology. We had a he was an archaeology professor, but he taught us the history of the field and he brought in all the drama, all the, letters between, centuries old academics arguing with each other. And it was great fun. And it did help you remember it better because we learn from stories and we remember things that are told as stories. So
We
I
do.
love when that's
I
brought
agree.
into it. Yeah. All right. Do we have time for one last question?
One last question.
All right, Rob, you got it.
Okay, so not sure I understand the question. Hopefully Eugenie does. I do think getting political agreement is easy using lies and highly general applications. Do you know of studies comparing the level of congruence in science versus in religion? And then they said, I think there's a major reason that these lawsuits go badly for anti-science ideologues.
The process of science does eventually result in consensus for any given problem. A problem may be at various stages of understanding. But, once there have been enough tests of an explanation that scientists sort of cohere around the explanation, then a lot of the alternate hypotheses are just sort of ignored or have been refuted or displaced or when you don't mess with them anymore. I think, I don't know if I'm understanding the question, but when it comes to...
That was my problem. I'm guessing the kind of meaning, well, science agrees on things, and therefore they make a better case because different religions believe different things. But you haven't really faced that in these court trials.
Well, but the purpose of religion is not to explain the natural world. I mean, to some degree, I do believe in two magisteria. What science is trying to do is explain the natural world. We're not trying to tell you how to treat your fellow person. We're not trying to tell you whether it's moral that coyotes eat cats. That's not what science does. Science tells you that coyotes eat cats because they're tasty and they can be caught easily when coyotes move into cities. It doesn't tell you whether that's good or bad.
Man, I got 2 cats. I'm glad I don't live in any cities where there are coyotes.
Oh boy, we got coyotes all over the place in Berkeley. And the purpose of religion is to deal with other topics. I think those of us, especially those of us who are very cognizant about the creation and evolution controversy, and we've dealt with the history here, we sometimes forget that it's not the purpose of religion to tell us where the Coconino sandstone in Grand Canyon came from. That's not what religion is about. Religion is about purpose. It's about meaning. It's ultimately about the relationship of human beings to a non-material universe, which contains gods or ancestor spirits or other supernatural beings that are different from, there's a whole complex of characteristics around the supernatural beings that are specific to religion as opposed to animistic characters. But where the two come into conflict is where one or the other tries to invade the turf of the other, so to speak, where people try to explain the origin of the universe, the origin of the planet Earth, where plants and animals come from, where humans come from, where you're trying to explain those elements which really are elements of the natural world, and you're trying to explain them through a supernatural causation. We got to talk. You're out of your depth. This is where religion does not do nearly as well as science does in terms of answering those questions. Frankly, science doesn't answer questions about any number of moral and ethical issues that human beings also need to consider. For that, you need to have philosophy and you need to have religion. Science is a way of understanding the natural world. It doesn't tell you, like I say, how to treat your fellow human. Now, that doesn't mean that facts and logic and things that we associate with science can't inform your ethical and logical positions on things. That's totally legitimate, but they cannot compel them. They cannot determine them. One of the things I learned very, very early in dealing with the creation and evolution issue is how many Christian theologians are on my side of this issue.
That's fascinating.
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, I cut my teeth on the creation and evolution issue as a college professor in Lexington, Kentucky, when back in the 1980s, we had the Citizens for Balanced Teaching of Origins that wanted to introduce creation science into the Lexington School District curriculum. And they would bring scientists from California, the Institute for Creation Research, of course, to come and train our teachers. And wouldn't this be great? We'd be on the cutting edge of science. And of course, up on campus, it was up with this, we will not put. We just hit the fan about this. We weren't going to put up with this. I was invited to give talks all over the place. I gave talks to the Rotary and the, other civic institutions. I gave talks to, of course, the Unitarians were on our side right away. The rabbi was on our side right away. They realized instantly that this was Protestant fundamentalism that was being passed off as science, and they were not fooled. One of the groups that I was asked to give a talk to was the Lexington Alliance of Religious Leaders, or Laurel. And, just like every other group has its monthly fellowship meeting, they have lunch and fellowship and have a speaker and all that. So did Laurel. And they invited me in. I think it was probably Rabbi Leffler who invited me to come and speak for Laurel. And I explained what creation science was and how it really was biblical literalism. And boy, you could see the Catholic and the mainstream Protestant ministers going, oh, we didn't know that. Their position was they did not want biblical literalist Christianity taught Monday through Friday and then have to straighten out the kids on the weekend, because that was not their theology. They were not special creationists. They did not take Genesis literally. They thought that that was an extremely poor kind of theology that was not theirs, and that's not what they taught in Sunday school. So one of the things that I learned, not being a practicing Christian anymore and not really going to church or not thinking about church for a very, very long time, one of the things I learned with the Lexington controversy is how much variation there was in the Christian community about science, the natural world, what can religion say about the natural world. And most of them were saying very little, render unto science that which is sciences. We're here to talk about other important issues. So some of my best friends are Christian theologians who agree with me completely when it comes to science. But to them, they would talk about climate change, say, what are the consequences of climate change to our Lutheran theology, say? How can we address the issue of climate justice, for example? They're not saying, let's talk about whether CO2 is a warming gas or how much methane there is in the, they're not interested. I mean, they're interested as people, but, the scientific issues only inform their religious beliefs. What they really want to talk about is things like social justice. Why are we putting power plants in poor neighborhoods and things like that? Yeah, there's a lot more variation out there in Christian theology than I think many of us non-believers would recognize.
Okay, yeah, that's a fascinating topic. I work the helpline, and occasionally, mostly if it's a Christian or arguing the subject of who's going to hell, it's basically, well, no, all Christians believe the same thing, so there's fine. But, you'll get people on the other side of that. No, every single other denomination besides mine is wrong, and they're going to hell.
Yep. They're as argumentative as scientists.
Except in their case, it's just opinion to make the decision.
Indeed. Well, folks, this has been really fun spending some time with you tonight. Thank you for inviting me, Rob and Kara. This was fun. And
Thank you for
Thank you so much
joining.
for
I
coming
enjoyed being
back
here.
and filling us in on the festivities at the 100th anniversary commemoration and all of the other stuff we've talked about.
Well, the talks will be online for that Chattanooga CFI FFRF conference, and the talks are already online for that Vanderbilt conference. So you can geek out just like Glenn and I did by going online and checking them out and have fun.
Awesome. And can't wait to have you back to talk about identifying tooth fragments.
I'm sure the number of people who would come to that can be counted on one hand. And that's if you're missing your thumb. Bye, everybody.
Take
Good
care,
night.
Eugenie.
Thanks for joining.